Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today we are discussing our week in review. As we do every Thursday, we are discussing the last 7 founders that I published on both YouTube and my website, an article, founderoftheday.com. Thank you for coming. Thank you for enjoying the American Revolution. I'm a little bit frazzled right now. I was just at a little bit of a rock and roll show that my local park puts on Thursdays over the summer. It's a whopping good time, and I kind of had to rush home for it. Next week I'll leave a little earlier, I assure you. So, why don't we get right into the American Revolution and start talking about the founders? Now, as we do every week, we start off, Fridays, I publish an article about the federal farmer. I should note, I usually do an anti-federalist paper. Right now we are covering the federal farmer, and the federal farmer is a series of anti-federalist papers, probably written by Melancton Smith. We are not 100% sure. As I've said before, it was for a long time considered to be Richard Henry Lee, of the same Lee family of Virginia. But no, historians now presume it is Melancton Smith of New York, though again, we're not entirely sure. That being said, Federal Farmer was published in New York, one of the more important Federalist papers. And Federal Farmer number 4 is extremely interesting. It almost immediately after the Constitution was signed and sent out to the world for viewing, the people started criticizing it. And James Wilson, who is arguably one of the most important legal minds of the early republic, was one of the crafters of the United States Constitution. James Wilson, he gives a State House yard speech. It's a very famous speech, and it's kind of a prequel to what the Federalist Papers would later be talking about. In many ways, he outlines the Federalist Papers. However, he says that everything in the that the federal government can do has been enumerated in the Constitution. And Melancton Smith, or I should say Federal Farmer, disagrees with this. And actually, as it says next to me, he uses the 4th of his papers, or observations as they were known at the time. He uses the 4th observation to review whether or not the things were enumerated were so clearly defined. And his argument throughout this paper is, it's not as clear as the Federalists are making you think. There are a lot of things that are not very clear about the Constitution. The first one he points to is defining taxes. It's an old anti-Federalist favorite, talking about the taxes. But the Constitution, and again, this is at its birth, the Constitution has since changed with I believe it's the 16th Amendment, changed that taxes no longer have to be apportioned by state. But originally, the taxes were supposed to be apportioned by state. So each state was supposed to pay a certain amount. But it doesn't say whether or not this money could be collected from individuals. It doesn't say if it's collected from individuals or from the state. So does the state collect the money from the individuals and then give it to the federal government, or does the federal government just go into people's pockets and take? That was unclear. And again, the argument of this paper is not everything is oh so clear as it seems. So, unfortunately, for the Federalists, Melancton Smith seems to score a point on this one, as he does throughout the paper. Again, his argument is not specifically the Constitution bad, just Constitution not specific enough. He then goes on to a few other things. First of all, he goes to Article 2 of the Constitution and discusses the ability of the president to appoint inferior officers that get approved by the Congress. However, he says, who are these inferior officers? Inferior officers is a pretty vague term. Doesn't seem to be very specifically defined, now does it? Furthermore, he goes on to talk about the courts and how the courts are given appellate jurisdiction, but with, quote, with such exceptions as the Congress should make. And Federal Farmer literally says, what are these exceptions? That's not very clearly defined. Such exceptions as Congress shall make is pretty open-ended and fairly vague. And he then goes on to move from specifically defined powers to what he called unsecure powers, as in, it seems to be defined, but we don't know. He treads over some familiar anti-federalist territory here. The necessary and proper clause, anything can be necessary and proper if you really want it to be. What I found extraordinarily interesting is his discussion of treaties with other nations are to be the supreme law of the land. But nothing in the Constitution says that treaties have to fall in line with the Constitution itself. Now, what I'm about to say is going to sound bombastic and crazy, and in a way it is, but I'm doing it to demonstrate a point, but it also isn't necessarily unconstitutional, and that is, say the United States made a treaty with the King of Great Britain that said, the people of the United States will do whatever the King of Great Britain says. We will obey His Majesty. We will bow to him and have his nobles be our nobles. Now that sounds crazy, but there's nothing in according to the Constitution, if a treaty says that, then that's the supreme law of the land. And the argument here is, why doesn't the Constitution say that treaties have to fall in line with the Constitution? Seems pretty simple, but again, theoretically could still happen. Interestingly enough, it is exactly this type of situation that Thomas Jefferson, who at first, he's a Federalist, of course. He's never an anti-Federalist, but much bigger fan of the smaller governments, and ends up being kind of anti-administration for Washington and then the Adams administration. Thomas Jefferson goes on to make the Louisiana Purchase pretty early in his term, and he does this through a treaty because it was kind of unconstitutional for the president to just go out and buy all this land, but we could sign a treaty that says this land's now ours. We just have to pay some money for it. Well, that's the law now. So, he also, should note, Federal Farmer ends this one with a cry for a Bill of Rights, as per usual when you're talking about anti-federalists. So that's a brief wrap-up of the Federal Farmer. Hope you enjoyed it. Take a quick sip of my coffee, and we're going to move on to William Blount. Now, William Blount is an amazing person. His story is fantastic. I'm going to sip this coffee real quick. Excuse me, I get my energy up for this amazing conversation. William Blount is from North Carolina, and his family is patriot all the way. A bunch of his brothers joined the Continental Army as soldiers. He joins the Continental Army as a, was it a paymaster? He was a commissary for Horatio Gates for a while, which is, an important position, an administrative one, but important nonetheless. He ends up leaving the army about the time of Yorktown because he's elected to the North Carolina Assembly. And as with many people, he wanted to help lead from within. While he's a part of the Assembly, about a year later, he's sent to the Continental Congress. And this is the time in the Continental Congress where you see many young men showing up. Your Alexander Hamiltons, your James Madisons. It is a position for young assembly members in the state to, it's kind of a stepping stone. No one really wants to go to the Continental Congress, but if you're a young man trying to make a name for yourself in politics, well, you can go meet people from other colonies, come back, and now you're someone in the know, aren't you? As with many of these people, William Blount realized, this is not working out very well. That being said, at the time, Congress was trying to pay for itself. It was trying to figure out what to do with its western lands. He ends up doing two things with the land that we now consider Tennessee. At the time, it was all mostly considered part of North Carolina. A large portion of it he gives to, or not he, but he works out a deal on behalf of his state to, instead of pay the money North Carolina owed for the Revolutionary War, they were going to pay in land. They'll hand some land over to the Continental Congress as their payment. Several states did the same thing. It wasn't uncommon. Immediately after, he goes back to North Carolina, and he helps pass several laws that are, well, let's say, it makes it a lot easier for common people to buy land in what was then Tennessee. Not the land that was sold, but the land that was still owned by North Carolina. An important distinction, because Georgia would sell the land that was sold, and that becomes the Yazoo land fraud, and it's a mess. North Carolina avoids that a little further north in Tennessee. And at this point, he has now kind of set up Tennessee for development. He has sold a bunch of it to the Continental Congress, which is going to use it to pay debts and give it to soldiers. That land's going to get sold and settled. He's also made it easier for North Carolinians to settle that same area. So if and when, wink, wink, when that becomes its own state, now suddenly Tennessee has a whole lot of North Carolina living inside of it to give it more of a North Carolina feel and sympathies with North Carolina, which is not just important for North Carolina itself, but also because this is Tennessee, Kentucky, everything over the Appalachian Mountains on this side of the Mississippi were kind of at risk of running into a situation where maybe they get annexed by Spain, or maybe they decide to join up with France and cede from the United States. This was all possible. Even before this, the state of Franklin was trying to cede and make its own territory, not cede from the United States, although there were several places that did try and cede from the United States at large. Anyway, William Blount then goes on behalf of the Continental Congress to this same area where he is meant to negotiate a treaty with several nations, the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw Native American nations. He's supposed to negotiate a treaty with. Now, he arrives late and doesn't really take part in the negotiations. What comes out is it's called the Treaty of Hopewell, though it's better called the Treaties of Hopewell because it is technically separate treaties with each Native American nation. Benjamin Hawkins takes the lead on that. There are a few other gentlemen whose names are eluding me. I have a name in my head, but I don't want to say the wrong one, so I'm going to keep it to myself because I don't remember exactly who participated. What I did research this week was William Blount, and he gets there late, but he does sign the treaty, so that's good on him. Now, he ends up going back to North Carolina, and they say, hey, there's this meeting in Philadelphia we'd like for you to attend. Blah, blah, blah. Easy for me to say. There's this meeting in Philadelphia we'd like for you to attend. Now, that meeting in Philadelphia we today call the Constitutional Convention. William Blount does go to the Constitutional Convention, and he hangs around for a week or two. He breaks the secrecy rule and sends a copy of the first draft of the Constitution to William Caswell, the governor of North Carolina, which was against the rules. He does that and basically leaves immediately and continues north because he is, again, a member of the Continental Congress, which was at the time meeting in New York City. So he travels up north, stops in Philadelphia, breaks the rules, leaves the Constitutional Convention, and goes to New York for the Continental Congress, at which point he votes in favor of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. There were two Northwest Ordinances. The one of 1787 is the most important. It essentially was written by Thomas Jefferson before Jefferson went to France. It's important for several reasons. It settles how the lands in the Northwest Territory, what we now consider parts of Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, it settles how that's all going to be settled, for lack of a better word. The people go, there is a little bit of an issue. There are still Native Americans living there, and they are very hostile to this idea. It's about this time that the Northwest Indian War breaks out, which lasts for several years, 5, 6, 7 years. There's violence up there. But what's probably most important about this legislation, it is the most important thing the Articles of Confederation ever got done. And additionally, it prohibits slavery in any of these states, which is really important. It leads to, it's one of the reasons the Mason-Dixon line becomes important later, and the North is slave-free and the South is not. And obviously this is an American Revolution channel and not a Civil War channel, but we know why that becomes a problem in the future. But it is a bold step to just immediately outlaw slavery in this gigantic portion of the young United States. It's about almost a third of the territory of the United States. William Blount is one of the few people to attend both the Constitutional Convention and vote for the, actually, he's the only person to attend the Constitutional Convention and vote for the Northwest Ordinance, because he's the only one who left the Constitutional Convention and went to the Continental Congress. And then what does he do? He leaves Continental Congress and goes south to Philadelphia, where he rejoins the Constitutional Convention. It doesn't really have much effect on the document because he missed almost the entire summer, but he does sign the Constitution because, first of all, you're there, although I should say there were 3 people there who did not sign the Constitution, but additionally, he was a Federalist. He did see the perks of having a more consolidated government of this nature. Especially, like I said, he was one of those young men who showed up in the early 1780s, about 5 years before this, who saw how the Okay, so the old guys started a revolution and fought this war, and they started this government, and they just left, and now we're in charge, and we have no way to raise money. We can't pay for the army. We can't do anything. And he was one of the men who saw the need for corrections. Now, this worked out really well for him. William Blount, uh, almost, George Washington gets elected soon thereafter, and he needs someone to take over the Southwest Territory, which was essentially Tennessee, also part of that Yazoo land fraud, but mostly Tennessee. And hey, people from Tennessee really like? Well, this William Blount character, who Washington knew a little bit from not just the war, but from when he popped in time to time at the Constitutional Convention. And he was also known now basically as the guy who had done all this work to get Tennessee settled. Therefore, George Washington taps Blount on the shoulder and says, "Can you go to Tennessee and start it?" And he does. He goes to Tennessee. He is essentially the founder of Tennessee. Now, there are other people who can claim this argument. Is it Richard Henderson, I believe the name is, who basically founded Kentucky, then Tennessee, and wrote the first Constitution. But Blount shows up the first territorial governor representing the United States, who had a lot of hands in this area already. And he's the one who really writes the first government under the authority of the United States. He's the one, he appoints officers, he has elections, he does a census, which is really important to figure out, do we have enough people here for a state? And they find out, oh yeah, we got enough people real quick. I do want to note, though, one of the officers he appoints is the first attorney general, a young man, about 19 years old, named Andrew Jackson. And William Blount is the one who introduces Andrew Jackson into Tennessee politics and politics in general. Jackson had just become a lawyer. So this gentleman, William Blount, is really one of the main reasons that Andrew Jackson becomes Andrew Jackson. Anyhoozle, William Blount then, he has elections, and he is elected as the first senator from Tennessee. There is a problem, though. Tennessee is not a state yet, and therefore doesn't get a senator. So, not Senator William Blount goes over to the capital, which at the time was Philadelphia, and he says, "Hey guys, guess what? I'm a senator now." And they say, "No, you're not. Come on, man. No, you're not." And he says, "Well, you just let Vermont and Kentucky in." And they say, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, how about we let Tennessee in?" And a few years later, I got the date, it's May 31st, 1796. William Blount is he's actually not, he wouldn't have been in the room, I shouldn't say that. But William Blount successfully, with the help of a few others in Philadelphia, gets Tennessee to become the 16th state in the Union of the United States of America. And he is immediately appointed as its first senator, because, they had an election. And, it seems like it was right. Plus, again, he had been territorial governor, so he was familiar to all these people. He'd been to the Constitutional Convention. They knew who he was. They were like, "Sure, William, go ahead. You could be senator." Oh, by the way, Tennessee, like all states, got 2 senators, but it was so small that it only got 1 delegate in the House of Representatives. And that first delegate in the House of Representatives was William Blount's protege, Andrew Jackson. Again, big guy over here. So, unfortunately for Blount, I should note too that when he created Tennessee, he created the capital at Knoxville, which he named after Henry Knox, who, as territorial governor, George Washington was the boss, but really his boss was Henry Knox. So he names Knoxville after his boss, bookseller, Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Unfortunately for Blount, during this time, the land speculation market collapsed, and he had been speculating wildly in all this land he was able to sell in Tennessee, and like many important American founders, he lost all his money. Also, you remember how I said that it was iffy that maybe these territories west of the mountains might align with another nation, and how Spain was a problem? Well, Blount secretly negotiated with Great Britain to try and have Britain invade New Spain. Unfortunately, he was found out about this and accused of treason, and he faced impeachment as a senator for, secretly negotiating with the British to invade another country. If this sounds familiar, it's basically what Aaron Burr was accused of, minus negotiating with the British. Aaron Burr was just going to go do it all by himself, which I guess is better, because Blount was talking with Great Britain to invade Spain, more or less. So what he decides to do is essentially skip bail and run away. And he does this, and he runs away, and he goes back to Tennessee, where he's still considered a hero. And unfortunately, an epidemic breaks out, and he quickly succumbs to the disease and dies with a shadow over his name, more or less. Despite, as I said, being a really, really important founder, like arguably, the founder of Tennessee. In my opinion, the founder of Tennessee. The man who made Andrew Jackson's career into what it was. The man who signed the United States Constitution and approved the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. An amazingly important American founder who is often overlooked, as they all seem to be, and died with, like I said, that little bit of shame over his name. We're going to let that go today. And we're going to move on to our next founder. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Thank you for coming. If you guys have any questions, let me know. That's what I'm here for. We're going to talk about Washington's mommy. Oh, sorry you heard me drinking. I needed that coffee. It was a busy day. George Washington had a mother. And his mother was still alive when he became president of the United States. I was a little shocked to read that too. You see George Washington and think, oh, what an old man. But no, George Washington was in his mid-40s when he took over the Continental Army, and he was mid to late 50s when he became president. So his parents were still alive. Well, no, his father had died when he was very young, but his mommy was still alive. And I know, I keep calling her mommy, and it's just not very polite. I just think it's silly, and I like to have fun here. Hi, Jay. Well, we'll see if she was a proud mommy. Let's talk about it. So, Mary Ball was orphaned at just 13 years old. Her father died when she was an infant, and her mother died when she was 13. She was taken into the care of an uncle, George Eskridge. And George Eskridge would, almost a decade later, introduce her to Augustine Washington, who became her husband. Augustine already had 2 sons and was a widower. He marries a lot younger Mary, and they have a child. And their first child together, they name after the man who introduced them, and the man who essentially raised her from teenager to adulthood, George Eskridge. So that's how George Washington gets his first name, from the uncle, aka adoptive parent of Mary Washington, and the person who introduced his parents. Fun fact. Now, George Washington grows up, and he wants to join the Royal Navy. And in fact, he's given an opportunity to join the Royal Navy. But it turns out Mary Ball came from a fairly wealthy family, and she had a brother over in London. And the brother in London writes back home and says, Mary, don't let your son join the Navy. He's not going to advance far enough. It is not a good career for him because he will never excel. He's a colonist. He's only going to get so far. He writes, I read the one letter, I forget the exact number, and this is hard to hear, but he essentially said George has, I think it was 5 or 6 slaves, or servants as they call them, and that would give him the opportunity to build a reputation as a Virginia planter. Again, of course, we know now slavery is the worst, and it's not great. But at the time, it was like, okay, he has an opportunity to excel. If he finds the right career, obviously he had already made connections that hooked him up with the Royal Navy. If he has these ins, he can excel in life if he plays his cards right. And because of this, Mary Ball goes to George and says, George, you can't join the Navy. Now, there has been a wide variety of historical interpretations of how this conversation may have gone. For a long time, it was Mary Ball was smart and told her son, don't join the Navy. That's dumb. You should go be a surveyor. That's good. And George did, and everything was great. Now, over the last few decades, historians seem to have looked at it and said, well, Mary Ball, George wanted to do something, and she was a mean mom who said, no, don't do what you want, do what I want. No, I've come to the conclusion it's probably somewhere in the middle, where his mom said, listen, this is a bad idea. And George probably said, I'd really like to join the Navy, Mom. And Mary said, no, I'm going to have to put my foot down. And George went, oh, and pouted away, and then quickly got over it and became a surveyor. And we know now that George Washington does make a very successful surveyor and makes a lot of money surveying and increases the size of his plantation and the number of servants he has, which again, not great, but for the time was very important to make your way up in the world. Professor Greg over at the History That Doesn't Suck podcast, I think put it best. George Washington, when he comes of age at this point where he chooses his career, he's one of the elites in society, but he's like the lowest rung of elites. He's not from these planter families. He's not a Lee or a Carter or any of these giant wealthy landowning families. The way Professor Greg put it was, I'll paraphrase here, George Washington was the poorest kid at the rich kids charter school. So like, he was there, he was hobnobbing with the fancies, but he wasn't necessarily himself. He never really felt comfortable. Not that he didn't feel comfortable in that company, but some of that company didn't feel comfortable with him there. Wink, wink. That being said, many of that company did like having Washington around. That's why he found these opportunities. That's why he was friendly with the royal governor and was appointed the surveyor. That's why he gets appointed colonel and he goes out and starts the 7 Years' War. He was a very ambitious young man. So anyway, back to Mary. Because of this discussion, no matter how it went, Washington does become a surveyor, and it does broadly affect his career. Now, George and his mom, their relationship could be strained at times. And in fact, over and over again, you see George Washington complaining about her asking him for money. Now, by 1771, Mary Ball is a bit of an older woman now, and she is not the best at living on her own. So George buys her a house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is just a few doors down from her daughter, who was also George Washington's sister, who also survived. By the way, George Washington had a sister, and I think it was 4 of his brothers were still alive when he became president. We don't think of him as a family man very much, but he had family. Either way, his sister Betty lives down the street. She can go take care of Mom when she needs to. George is always giving her money, this and that. And then George Washington is chosen as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. By the way, in the intermeeting time, he started a whole bunch of businesses. There's a book that came out recently. The name escapes me, but talks about George Washington as the entrepreneur. Like, he was a businessman. And this businessman is put in charge of the Continental Army. And during this time, I'm sure it's a proud mother, you would think, but at one point, in 1781, she applies to the state of Virginia for a pension because she says, I'm an old person who can't take care of myself. Now, Washington's friend, Benjamin Harrison, who was governor of Virginia at the time, and by the way, would have a son and grandson be president of the United States, and Harrison himself was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he sees this pension from George Washington's mom and contacts George and is like, hey man, does your mom really need help? And George is like, oh mom, oh my god. Oh my god. Like, oh mom, you're so embarrassing me in front of my friends, mom. And he writes to Harrison and says, no, don't give her any money. Like, she's good. I bought her a friggin' house. Like, she has what she needs. Don't give her any money. And he, like, you see him give this, like, there's a little correspondence between Washington and his mom saying, like, mom, like, I keep giving you money. Where's all the money going, mom? Like, go ask Samuel. There are other siblings you can ask. Anyway, Washington continues to have that's the relationship with Washington's mom. He obviously loves his mom, and it seems like she obviously loves him, but they do have this kind of stereotypical mother-son relationship where they butt heads from time to time. Now, in 1789, George Washington is elected President of the United States. You would think she'd be a proud mother. On his way from Virginia to New York City to become the first president of a nation he just created, In April of 1789, he stops in Fredericksburg to visit with his family. And now his mother at this point already has breast cancer, and they know that. And George essentially knows this is the last time he'll ever see his mom. Now, we don't really know how the conversations went that day. There is a legend that persisted. In the mid 1800s, Mary Ball Washington became one of those larger than life figures where all these stories about all how great she was came out. Now, again, I'm not saying she wasn't great. I'm sure she was fine. As we've discussed, she sounds like a regular mom. However, there is a legend, I repeat, a myth, a legend, that Washington went and asked Mom one more time for permission. Just like he asked for permission to join the Royal Navy so many decades beforehand. He asked permission to become President of the United States. And I don't have the quote in front of me. It is a myth, but Mary Ball says something along the lines of, "Yes, son, make me proud." And then they say goodbye, and George Washington leaves, never to see his mother again. Again, it's a real tearjerker of a story. I'm even getting all teary-eyed over here just saying it, even though it's probably not true. It was just one of those stories that about Washington and his family that arose early on as part of. There was a time when Americans were trying to establish like an ethos, or not an ethos, but like other nations had so much history, and America was so young that we were trying to really firmly establish ours. Which to a degree we're very lucky they did in the early 1800s. You see in the early to mid 1800s, a lot of people writing biographies about their grandfathers. It's how we know about almost every officer of the Continental Army had a grandson who wrote a biography about them, which is great. They're often biased, and we got to remember that. But yeah, so Washington goes up and becomes president, and a narrative. Thank you, Jay. There it is, a narrative. It would be weird if she said no. No, dude, go home. He did want to retire. He probably would have loved if someone said no. But he goes and becomes president, obviously. Mary survives till the following August of 1789, when finally the breast cancer does take her life. I want to put some perspective on this. Mary Ball, we don't know when she was born. It was sometime between 1707 and 1709, which, first of all, makes her about 80 years old when she passes away. But for some perspective, between 1707 and 09 means Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mom, was between 1 and 3 years younger than Benjamin Franklin. Let that sink in for a second. I know we're talking about Washington now. I don't know why I'm pivoting to Franklin, but I like to say here that all the American founders knew Ben Franklin because they grew up reading Ben Franklin, reading Poor Richard's Almanac. He was older than George Washington's mom, who, by the way, Ben Franklin lives about another 6 months after Washington's mom. Again, just adding to the perspective, just building on the canvas we're creating here, one story at a time. So, back to the story. Mary Ball Washington, like I said, she passes away, sadly, at about 80 years old. And Washington gets the news from his, it's like a cousin, writes on behalf of his sister who was there, telling the president, your mom died. And it's interesting because George Washington writes back to his sister, sending condolences and saying, she's in a better place now. He says it fancier than I say it, but, more along the lines of she's in a better place. And then he immediately starts talking about her complaining he doesn't give her enough money. Immediately. In the letter he sent to his sister, it's like, again, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have it in front of me, but he's more or less saying like, well, at least we don't have to worry about her asking us for money anymore. Which I thought was fascinating. That his mind, he knew his mom was dying. She had breast cancer. She was aging, so, and older than most people lived at the time. But the fact that he immediately was resolved to the, like, at least we don't have to give her, I feel like it just demonstrates a ton about the relationship they had. There was an obvious love and compassion between them, but also an obvious financial, I don't want to say burden, but, he'd been taking care of her for decades at that point. So, I should also note when she dies, there's kind of an unofficial mourning when the nation. I mean, everyone knows George Washington. He's running the presidency, and his mom dies, and everyone knows. So they have kind of a few days of mourning there. And Washington actually spends about 6 months wearing a badge, a black badge around his wrist. So half of his first year as president of the United States, he's wearing a black badge in memory of his mother, which I thought was fascinating. Jay, I see your question here. Do we have any idea what the heck she was spending on or how much George was providing? I do not. I'll be honest. That's a great question. I'm sure it varied. I am certain it was enough to live on. Again, if there was real problems, there would have been letters from his sister saying, "Hey, mom, like, needs money." Like, and his sister married a gentleman, I forget his first name, Lewis, who was a patriot himself. They owned a merchant shop in Fredericksburg. They weren't the wealthiest people, but they were fine. And he actually supplied, like, I believe it was cannons and stuff for the Continental Army. So really, that's an interesting story in itself. I don't know how much exactly he was providing. What she was spending it on, that doesn't make sense to me. She seemed to like to enjoy her life going out into her garden. I didn't find any fancy expenditures or anything of that nature. I mean, it's not like there was like a lot to spend money on back then. She was probably importing fancy stuff, which is why it didn't arrive. Or didn't, that's the assumption I would make. But no, that's a great question. Honestly, Jay, that's a great question I didn't actually think to even investigate. And I don't know why. Thank you for bringing that up. I will have to look into that. Thank you. That's a great question. Those are both great questions. Again, he was definitely providing enough. Because you would see letters from his sister saying, "We need more money for mom." Instead, as I said, the first letter he writes when he finds out his mom dies is to his sister. And he immediately says, "At least we don't have to spend any more money." Which indicates to me that his sister would probably also have agreed that they were fine. She was fine. That they had given her plenty of money. By that point, as I mentioned before, George Washington was kind of pushing his way into the elites. By the time he's president, George Washington is one of the elites. He's entered the boys' club. And therefore, money is not, I won't say money is not a problem, but you know what I'm saying. Nick. Hi, Nick. What's her opinion on Martha Washington? Did Mary like Martha visiting George at camps during the war? Oh, that's a good question too. Man, I ran into something. I should note. Mary Ball Washington had a rock she liked to pray on. She liked to climb on a rock to pray. I didn't include that in my article or anything. I don't know how to fit it in. Did she? I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about her relationship with Martha. Now, I remember, and this isn't from my research this week, but I do remember reading that they were cordial, if not lovey-dovey. That makes sense? Like, okay, you're marrying George. She was probably happy about all the money that came with Martha Washington, and the Dandridge, and more importantly, the Custis money. But I don't know how strained they were. And did she like Martha visiting at the camps? It's weird you're asking this question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I know I've read about this very specifically a long time before Founder of the Day, and that's why my memory's failing me. It was before I started any of this. So I apologize, Nick. Man, these are great questions. You guys are nailing it today. I would love to know. I will look more into this for next week. I will do more research on Mary Ball Washington. I did not expect so much interest on Mary Ball compared to all the other founders. But I can see why. It's George Washington's mommy. She's really interesting. But I'll tell you what, I will do more research on this, and next Thursday we'll have a little bit of a prequel before we go into the founders. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Or maybe at the end. I don't know. We'll figure it out. If you're here at the beginning, I'll wait till the end. Yeah, okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Someone did bounce while I was undecided on these great questions. Usually I'm more confident in my questions. Truthfully, I guess I'm not as confident about Mary Ball Washington as I thought. So with that being said, let's carry on. We got a bunch of people to go through. We're already 40 minutes in. John Patten. Okay, a big swing from Maryborough, Washington to John Patten. There's not as much to say about Mr. Patten over here. Um, excuse me. He was a small town farmer in Delaware when the American Revolution breaks out. He joins the fight. He becomes a member of the Continental Army. He starts as a low-level officer, eventually makes his way up to major, serves in most of the battles early in the war, especially in the north, Trenton, Brooklyn, Saratoga. And he acts as a corridor, a courier, a letter carrier, a courier for George Washington himself during Valley Forge. So he's actually bringing the communications from Washington to Lafayette to Arnold to, he's going from high-ranking general to high-ranking general, carrying information, which is one of those extremely important jobs. Nowadays, you can send a text message. Back then, you needed a dude to go do it for you. So one of those really important and underappreciated positions in the Continental Army that kept the gears of war turning, especially, like I said, he did this during Valley Forge. While, we discussed last week about Clement Biddle, who was trying to get food for the army. So a really tough time to be doing that. Now, Patten joins, he goes south for the Battle of Camden. And I don't talk about Battle of Camden all that much. Horatio Gates' triumphant return to the field doesn't end very well. Battle of Camden is probably the worst defeat of the Revolution, not by numbers, but by morale. At this point, the Americans have started doing pretty good in the war, and then now they essentially lose everything south of Virginia, thanks to Horatio Gates. John Patten is there. He fights. The Delaware soldiers are kind of annihilated. Patten survives, but he goes to prison. He is taken as a prisoner of war, spends several months in a prison camp. Eventually, as things are unwinding in 1781, the following year, he is paroled, and he goes back home. And at this point, although he was basically just a farmer, he, like many former soldiers, wanted to get into politics, and he does get into politics, and he's pretty quickly elected to the state assembly. Works his way up a little bit. After about a year, much like William Blount, he is also sent to the Continental Congress. During the middling years, while these young men who are trying to make a name for themselves, as we discussed earlier, young man trying to make a name for himself in local state politics, goes to the Continental Congress to come back and say, hey, I went to the Continental Congress, put it on my resume. He does, and then he comes back. Eventually, the Constitution is ratified, and we have a new government, and we need to elect some people. Now, he doesn't run for the first term. He runs for the third session of the United States Congress to represent Delaware, and he wins. Does he? I don't know. He thinks he does. Everyone thinks he does. And John Patten goes to the United States House of Representatives, where, after one entire year serving as a congressperson, John Patten is informed, hey, your election's been overturned. Get out of here. You see, he ran against this guy, Henry Latimer, who was also an important member of Delaware's state assembly, and actually, years earlier, had recommended Patten to George Washington for a post, I think it was a customs collector position in Delaware. So they were, like, not the worst of enemies, but, well, if you think questionable elections are anything new, they are obviously not, because this is the George Washington administration we're talking about here. It's the 1790s. And basically, it's kind of a hanging chad situation. You see, Latimer said, hey, there's a problem with all these ballots. Now, I'm unable to determine what exactly the problem was. You think it would be easier to find. I went through a lot of documents trying to figure out exactly what they did here. Because Congress, which at this point was heavily Federalist, they decided, oh yeah, we're going to side with Federalist Latimer and get rid of this Democratic Republican, or at that point, anti-administration, John Patten. Get out of here, Pats. And he said, okay, see ya. I'm unable to determine exactly what the issue was, but there are several elections that were questionable throughout the colonies, the young states at this point. Notably the, Boston early on, when they were writing their first constitution, had some problems. About this exact same time, John Jay is running for governor against Henry Clinton, and there's a similar situation. Usually, what it is either these names are spelled wrong. Like, think about it, when you hear the name John Patten, you probably want to spell it with an O instead of an E. Patten. That's how we're accustomed to seeing it. So if someone maybe only heard the guy's name and never actually read it, they might have written it down because you had to write it out yourself. They might have spelled it wrong. And then Latimer can say, no, this is a different guy. There's a different guy named John Patten. That must be who they voted for, right? Additionally, there were certain times where getting the ballots in did not come in time. And like New York is a weird example. I'm not even going to get too into that. But essentially, like if the sheriff didn't show up from your county, didn't show up in time with all the ballots, then it doesn't count. So because of this, the Congress decides, no, looks like Latimer won. We know you've been here an entire year of a 2-year term, but you have to go now. So Patten leaves, immediately runs again, and is elected right back into office because there wasn't really a problem with the spelling on the ballots. People just didn't know how to spell his name. And that was the guy they wanted. And that's okay at this point because Latimer, his opponent, had actually then been appointed to the United States Senate. So no harm, no foul for anyone. He hangs around for another, for that one time and goes back home. He ends up being convinced to run again, although he decides he finally is convinced to run again. He wants to retire and doesn't want to, but at a time where George Washington didn't want to be president, but his country needed him. So he stepped up to serve, and he loses this time. It's actually probably a good thing he loses, because sadly, he ends up dying about 2 months later. Kind of suddenly. He lost to James Bayard, who is another founder we've discussed about, and I just realized I forgot to link to when I put the article out this week, but we'll correct that later. So that's John Patten. Kind of a rando in the American founding, but I think this story is fascinating, and I assume you do too. We're going to breeze right through him. We're going to head over to Bishop William White. I did add the word bishop in the front there. I usually don't. I am going to take a sip of my water real quick. Which, as it hit my lips, I realized was coffee, and it's getting a little bit late for that, but here we are. I got to talk a lot, and we're having fun here. Thank you so much for coming, guys. If you want to hit like, that's the most fantastic thing you can do in the whole world for me. Bishop William White founded the Magdalen Society. So, we're going to talk about religion a little bit, and I am not good at talking about religion. Wait, don't go anywhere. It's fun, I promise. For those of you who are very religious, I did not mean to offend you. It's just, some people find military history fun. Some people find religious history fun. So blah, blah, blah. I don't talk about religion that much because I'm not really thoroughly versed on it. Now, that being said, I put a lot of time into this discussion. There is one thing that I am 99.999% sure of, but for whatever reason, I'm uncomfortable saying it on camera because I feel like I might be wrong. And that is the Episcopal Church. My understanding is that the Episcopal Church was essentially created in the United States because before the American Revolution, a whole bunch of people believed in the Church of England, aka Anglicanism. But when you throw off England and the Church of England makes their pastors swear an oath of allegiance to the King of England, you found yourself in a little bit of a pickle because you believe in the same God. Your religion is the same. It's just you can't swear that oath of allegiance to the king anymore if you're an American preacher of the Church of England. So Episcopalianism kind of fills the void in this situation. Now, this affects all religion broadly, and there is a huge amount of change going through all religions in the United States throughout the 1780s, leading up to the Continental Congress. And at the beginning of the George Washington administration is really when the Second Great Awakening begins. So it's a really fascinating part of religious history in the world, let alone in American history. Again, I'm not an expert on it. If I said anything wrong there, please let me know. I've never been confronted saying that before. I'm neither Episcopal. I have a Lutheran and Jewish background. So those are the two forms of religion I was raised knowing the best. It doesn't mean I haven't studied other religions, but I'm certainly far from an expert in it. And the last thing I want to do is offend anyone, because I will also remind you that one of the reasons we have freedom of religion is part of the First Amendment isn't necessarily for Jews or Muslims or anything of that nature, or even Catholics. It was primarily because you had Episcopalians and Congregationalists and Anglicans and Methodists and Quakers and all these different denominations of Christianity at large. And it was more of a fear of having one denomination of Christianity taking over America than having America itself be a Christian nation. Everyone just assumed that, of course, it's going to be a Christian nation, but which type of Christian is it? And that brings us to William White. William White goes to England, becomes a priest, comes home, and then the Revolutionary War breaks out. And he's in Philadelphia. And it's tough to be a preacher in Philadelphia. It's tough to be anything in Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. It's very tough to be a preacher because you either have to swear oath of allegiance to the king, in which case the Patriots are going to put you in prison, or when the British come through, you have to not swear an oath to the king, in which case the British put you in prison. Somehow, William White is able to tread this fine line and pretty much go about his business in Philadelphia during this time. Now, it does seem that he had some sympathies with the Patriots because once the Revolutionary War comes to a conclusion, he comes out as a preacher and is like, hey, I believe in God, which everyone's like, yeah, we know, man. And he ends up is one of the several people that take the lead in this confusing situation. He ends up going over to England because he needs to be consecrated by someone in the church. Now, everyone there is afraid to consecrate an American who won't swear an oath of allegiance to the king when they've all swear oaths of allegiance to the king. And it's not just swear oath of allegiance to the king, but it's pray for the king and pray for Parliament and pray for England. Not pray for America, pray for England. So some of the bishops in England and Scotland were nervous that they would go to hell if they I just used the word. It's consecrated one of these heathen Americans. And eventually, William White and another gentleman who I apologize, their name escapes me, become the first people consecrated in England. Samuel Seabury, who is now kind of famous from the Broadway play Hamilton. He's the one who has that debate with Hamilton early on where they're rapping at the same time. Samuel Seabury was a loyalist, but he ends up being okay after the war because he goes to Scotland. And the Scottish are a little more cool with not praying for the King of England. So they give Samuel Seabury a consecration, and he goes up to New England. He's in Connecticut. Comes back. Everyone forgets about his being a loyalist because, hey, he's a bishop. Sweet, we got one. William White and this other gentleman come back. They go to London, are actually consecrated by the three bishops, the Bishop of Canterbury and then two other ones, but the Bishop of Canterbury taking the lead. And they're like, fine, we're going to risk going to hell so that you can save all these American souls, which is pretty sweet of them. So William White comes back, and in this situation, he meets up with other leaders, and they create the Episcopal Church of the United States in 1789, and he is ordained as the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. Now, he only holds this position for 1 year and then is passed on, but then in 1795, a few years later, he's again made presiding bishop, and he this time holds the position for 40 years. So he is essentially leading the Episcopal Church for the first 40 years of its existence. Because again, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but everything I've read indicates to me that the Episcopal Church, I'm just nervous saying the wrong thing about religion. I know I'm right about so many things I discuss here, but when it comes to religion, I'm nervous about even saying the right thing the wrong way. So I apologize. Please don't get offended. But the Episcopal Church, he is the leader of it for the first essentially 50 years of its existence. And it more or less creates the church, keeps it going, keeps it thriving. During this time, and I should probably have that underneath his name here, but during this time, he becomes known for philanthropy. And many of the charitable organizations he starts and presides over end up not only still existing today in some fashion, but end up being mimicked in other cities and states around the young nation. And he has a dramatic role on how we go about using religion to oversee charities in the United States nowadays. Now, the first religion he starts is called the Magdalen Society of Philadelphia. Magdalen societies had already arisen in Europe, especially England, where he learned about them, and he wanted to bring it to the United States. Now, I do want to shout out, he starts it with Robert Wharton, who becomes the first vice president with Bishop William White as the first president of the organization. Wharton family, one of those huge Philadelphia merchant families who have so many people that did so many middling things in the American Revolution that they're overlooked. They're like the Biddle family, or many other families that, like, so many members of the family did so many smaller things that we forget about them because they're not the big sexy names, the George Washingtons and Ben Franklins, but they were really important. So shout out to the Wharton family who helped start the Magdalen Society. What the Magdalen Society wanted to do was redeem wayward women. And by that I mean they wanted to help prostitutes stop being prostitutes. Now, the name Magdalen Society comes from Mary Magdalene. Again, I don't want to offend anyone when I speak about religion, but I understand Mary Magdalene may have been accused of being a prostitute, and that's where they get the name of the organization from. They are following Jesus's path by making these prostitutes be anything else but prostitutes. Suffice to say, it does not go well. And the society changes over centuries. Now, this organization technically is still around. Its name has changed. It's not even a society anymore. Now it's a group. They're called the White Williams Scholars. The White comes from Bishop William White. The Williams isn't him. It's another gentleman who came along the way and helped the organization into what it is today. Today, the organization is in Philadelphia, and it focuses on helping underprivileged children find ways to improve their situation, especially some of the more intellectually advanced children, finding them, helping them become leaders of society, as we hope some of our best and brightest might be. And so that legacy still lives on. He also started another school that's still around today. In 1820, he started the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf. Now, this was not the first school for the deaf. There have always been deaf people and always been people trying to help educate them, but this is the first one in Philadelphia. And that one, it still is in Philadelphia. And it also had many early influences. The gentleman who created the telegraph a few decades later is Samuel Morse. Didn't invent the telegraph, popularized it. I want to make that clear. He did not invent the telegraph, but he popularized it. I believe he had he was first working with the deaf. I think that was him. I shouldn't have brought this up. I've gotten out of my element. It's not the Revolutionary War. I'm out of my element. But many people, it was, suffice to say, the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf was always the forefront of new technology. So, I'm going to move over to our last founder today. I'm going to take a nice healthy gulp of water this time, not my coffee. It's getting hot in here. I got to turn off my AC when I do this, so it gets hot as I'm going. Or else you guys wouldn't hear me at all, because it would just be blasting right in my face. And that's why I get nice and beet red by the end of these live videos. Oh, I can't wait for the winter to come back. I'm a winter person. I know people don't... That's going to get people to leave. Yes, someone left immediately as soon as I said that. I like hockey and snow sports. I don't know what to tell you. I moved north for a purpose. All right. Let's talk about Jomes Warren. Now, the name Warren might sound familiar to you. Dr. Joseph Warren has become extraordinarily famous over the last few years. Since I started Founder of the Day, he was basically a nobody when I wrote my first few articles. He was one of my first articles. I was very excited to tell the world, and now he's everywhere. I'm friends with Christian Despina, who's written a book on him, and we've had Spencer Van Herrick, who portrays Warren. So this is not that Warren. This is Jomes Warren, a distant cousin of Joseph Warren, like a third or fourth cousins. I don't know how the trees. I can't. I try and do my own family tree. I can't even go straight up the line, let alone side to side. I can go straight up. My family gets murky along the way. That's all. What Jomes Warren is probably best known for is marrying extremely well. He is the husband of Mercy Otis Warren. Yes, Ashley, people do have strong opinions of the winter. We have learned the hard way. Jomes Warren is, unfortunately for him, best known for his wife, Mercy Otis Warren, who is the sister of James Otis, who is the firebrand of the revolution. He's the first Sam Adams. Sam Adams takes over for James Otis, essentially. Mercy Otis Warren also is a very famous author. She writes a bunch of plays. She ends up becoming the first woman to publish under her own name. She publishes anti-federalist papers. She ends up writing a book about the revolution, which her friends, John Adams and Abigail Adams, are no longer her friends after reading it because she talks some trash about her friends in a book she published under her own name as a woman, which, I'm being silly, is amazing. James Warren is not famous like any of his family or friends, which is kind of peculiar because when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he's already an important person in politics in Massachusetts. He's already a member of the Assembly. He joins the Provincial Assembly. He's already been working closely with, Sam and John Adams, Joseph Hawley, James Otis, cousin Joseph Warren. And then he is he gets the office of colonel in the Massachusetts militia just after Lexington and Concord, and he actually participates in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, what's interesting, when distant cousin Joseph Warren is killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill, well, Joseph Warren was the president of the Provincial Congress. The Provincial Congress being the revolutionary shadow government, as I like to call it. Of course, many of the royal governors dissolved the colonial governments leading up to the revolution, and all those colonial governments said, well, let's go meet over there and we'll be a provincial government. And Massachusetts was no different. Joseph Warren had taken over as president. He is killed at Bunker Hill, and James Warren is chosen to replace him. James Warren would be president of the Provincial Congress for the rest of its existence. 5 years. He is essentially the governor of Massachusetts, de facto governor, in everything but name. He is leading the Provincial Congress, which puts him in charge of the Committee of Safety, which is overseeing the militia and the war. He's in charge of the Committee of Correspondence, which is communicating with everyone else. He's in charge of keeping up with the delegates. He has a really interesting relationship via letter with John Adams, who's over in Philadelphia for most of the time, although Adams goes to Europe while James Warren is still running the show. During this time, Massachusetts promotes James Warren to Major General in the Massachusetts militia. Now, as a Major General in the Massachusetts militia, he was essentially executive of the state. He's one of the most important military figures in Massachusetts. I should note before that happens, he joins the army after the evacuation of Boston. He does act as paymaster general for the Continental Army for about a year. But when the army moves to New York, he says, I'm in charge of I have to stay in Massachusetts. I'm in charge of Massachusetts. I have to stay here. And resigns his post from the Continental Army. Then Massachusetts says, thanks for staying. You can be a major general. Now, at this point, there's really no more fighting in Massachusetts. So there's no need for him to be anything. But there's not a whole lot of Continental Army. That's what I should say. There's not a lot of Continental Army in Massachusetts because the Continental Army's moved on to where the fighting is. However, in August of 1777, James Warren resigns his post as Major General. He does continue on as president of the Provincial Congress. He resigns as Major General and essentially he sends a letter to John Adams saying, something we hear all the time, which is, why, if I'm a Major General, do I have to answer to a sergeant in the Continental Army? I severely outrank this person. Why do I have no say in what's going on in the Continental Army? And he resigns. And this is, it might sound like him being a baby, but many people were babies in this nature during the time. And he resigns that position, but again, sticks around. He oversees the creation of 2 constitutions. Massachusetts, after independence is declared, all the states run around and make a constitution. Massachusetts makes a constitution in 1777 that it's not ratified by the people. It's too democratic, as many people, Theophilus Parsons, for example, might argue. So, James Warren oversees the creation of a second constitution. And this one goes better, and it's created and approved. Accidentally outlaws slavery, as they would find a few years later. And James Warren, then they actually have an election for governor, and someone else is elected. I'm not even sure James Warren runs for governor. After 5 years in this position, he resigns, he does not win election, goes back and spends the rest of his career in state politics. It's not like he leaves Massachusetts or anything. But then he goes on to be an anti-federalist. Now, again, his spouse, Jomes Warren, is very known for her pen and her anti-federalism. He very much agreed with his wife's politics, and also becomes an anti-federalist, which, again, turns many of Federalist Massachusetts off to his ideas. Now, I do want to note, I never like to talk about women in I like, as I don't like to associate them with their husbands entirely. But this is a good opportunity to talk about Jomes Warren, because she was the first woman to publish under her name. Now, it's not cool that men had so much control over every aspect of their women's lives back then, but they did. And Jomes Warren could have been extraordinarily embarrassed by his wife publishing under her own name. It wasn't something that was done in polite society. And he theoretically could have stopped her. But he didn't. And in fact, he gave her the nickname his little scribbler. Or I added little, his scribbler. Because he was proud of her writing. And I know it sounds easy for us to say now, like, oh, what a great guy, let his wife publish in the papers. Like, especially as a white dude, it's hard for, like, I can't really be saying that. But at the same time, when you consider the lives they lived at the time, the fact that he not only permitted his wife to do this, but was proud of her for doing this, and lost friends because of some of her anti-federalist publishings, I do think it speaks a wild amount to his character. I think he should be commended for that at a time where it wasn't easy to do things. You know, we say the same thing about Aaron Burr and his daughter, giving his daughter the education. I know I probably shouldn't lump him in with Aaron Burr. Let's keep him lumped in with Jomes Warren, probably a better character to associate with. But it is, of all the commendable things that he did, that for the time and place he lived in, it probably is the most commendable. That he just saw her for her natural abilities and encouraged it, which was not, unfortunately, something we get a whole lot, or I shouldn't say we, that women got a whole lot of back at that point in time. So, thumbs up, Jomes Warren. Thanks for being president of Massachusetts and being pretty open-minded with the genders. So, excuse me. Those are the founders for the week. Thank you so much for watching, commenting, enjoying. Let me know if you have any questions. I did see a lot of people popped in later this week. I know I had to do a makeup version on Sunday, which was weird. A lot of people popped in there. But if you guys would prefer me starting a little bit later, I could totally do that. So let me know if it's more convenient for me to start at like 8:30 as opposed to 8:15. Jay, thank you for coming. Nick, Ashley, thank you for commenting. Hanging out. As always, it is a world of fun to do this. It is my great privilege that you guys come and learn along with me. Most of these articles, I have started republishing some of my old ones because I've left them behind, and it gives me more of an opportunity to make more videos and do interviews and such. Which, by the way, we got a bunch of fun interviews. I've done a few fun interviews coming up along the way. Yesterday's with Michael Troy was a blast, about the highest ranked major generals. Yeah, thank you. I'm learning with you guys. When I republish the articles, I've started a new method where I will go to my old ones, I'll look it up, I'll add a little bit, I'll edit them, make them better before I republish them, so I learn a little bit, something new every time. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm constantly learning new things about the American Revolution and the founding, and I really appreciate that you guys want to take the time to learn along with me and come here and check out these. I do want to note, too, that these founders I'm wrapping up. Not only do I publish the articles on my website every day, but I also make a video every day. I try and keep them brief, under 5 minutes. Some of them are almost 10. But I put them out every morning. So if you watch the live videos, YouTube might not be telling you that I do those. If you don't want to spoil them and just come for the live conversation on Thursdays, I understand that. That's fun too. But if you did want to see the actual videos, they're just one take, and I like this, but I'm like more targeted because, okay, I publish the article, I read it, it's in my head, and I give you a good rundown. This is more of a, hey, let's chit-chat and have fun with it. So, whatever your pleasure is, that's fine. If you hit like, that's the best thing in the world. But I want to make you guys aware that the pre-recorded videos, if you click on the live one, they might not tell you about the pre-recorded ones, and you might actually enjoy the pre-recorded ones, especially some of the interviews I do. They're fascinating. I've been really fortunate to meet a lot of people. In 2 weeks, I'm going to the American Revolution. Blah, 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 easy for me to say. The American Revolution Mohawk Valley History Museum American Revolution Conference. There it is. I nailed it. It's going to be a ton of fun. I'm not sure if I'm going to do actually any interviews there. I'm kind of hoping to, but I'll be talking to Christian Despigna will be there. Michael Troy, who's a frequent guest here. Just a ton of people are going to be there. So I'm very excited for it. I'm probably going to be, I'll probably shoot a live video or two while I'm there. I haven't really planned out what I'm doing yet. I actually just booked my hotel today, so we'll see. I am pumped though. And trivia on Fridays. So trivia is tomorrow. So definitely come for that. It's going to be a blasty blast, as it always is. Thank you for coming, guys. I am out of here, and I will leave you, as always, with that classic George Washington property, whose name I can't get enough of, Round Bottom.